seminar speaker, David. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. Okay. David is a full professor in the Department of Sociology and also co-faculty in the Transnational Data Analytics Institute at Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, yes. A similar institute to IACS. His research interests include social networks, most of you know that, group processes, computational modeling, and also stratification. He used a variety of computational methods, such as web-based experimental methods, network methods, and also simulation to study the emergence of social processes, such as cooperation, segregation, or stratification in complex systems. Some of his work has appeared in interdisciplinary venues like Nature Communications, PNAS, and the Science Advances. I mean, for societies to publish in these top journals is very rare. So Dave has tons of articles there. And also disciplinary venues like American Journal of Sociology, one of the top social journals, to name a few. He also developed methods, right? Regression, turn regression inside out, and also applications of regression for categorical outcome using R. And since 2019, he's the co-editor of Sociological Methodology, a leading American Sociological Association's flagship journal. So today he will discuss his work on how to stop the emergence of segregation in cooperative networks. Before I turn the floor to David, I want to mention several things. We share in common. First, we both, do research in segregation, right? But again, I try to approach this topic using big data to quantify segregation. Of course, your work gives me a lot of inspiration. Thanks. And also, we both graduated from University of Arizona, though we did not have any overlapping. I assume we both love, warm winter there, and of course, the summer is good. So welcome to Thanks.
Thank you all. Thanks, Rob, for that very warm introduction. I'm going to bring you with me and have you introduce me everywhere I go. I want to thank you all for coming today, and thanks so much for the invite. I should also thank, I feel obligated, I'll thank my colleague Brent Simpson, with whom I've published everything I'll be talking about today. And I also thank the Army and the National Science Foundation for supporting this work. So today I'll be talking, as Josh mentioned, how to stop the emergence of segregation in cooperative networks. So let's see, overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll first just kind of introduce what's called the problem of cooperation, at least from an interdisciplinary perspective, why it is that I think this is interesting. Then talk about some prior work on how it is that networks in particular promote cooperation. And then getting into the predictions having to do with this research, talk about reputation systems and the notion of preferential attachment, which is pretty popular in the networks community. And then I'll be talking about 2 large-scale experimental results. This paper was just accepted last week, finally, after 3 conditional accepts. Never heard that happen. Good Lord. And then I'll go into the discussion. All right, so cooperation can be defined as one agent paying a cost for another to receive a benefit. Given that definition of cooperation, its existence and nature is kind of perplexing, at least from an evolutionary biological perspective, because it means that agents are decreasing their own fitness to benefit others, which flies in the face of natural selection. So, well, there's been a lot of biologists who've made this point, some social scientists. But I think that aside from this being an interesting theoretical or evolutionary puzzle, the practical implications are very useful because not only can we contribute to an understanding of how this behavior evolved, but it's also useful to just understand what are the social factors that affect cooperation in our day-to-day lives. So it's kind of trying to touch on a couple of different topics there. So there's a pretty influential review piece that laid out the literature on the evolution of cooperation by Rand and Nowak. Published now a decade ago. And they say that natural selection opposes the evolution of cooperation unless specific mechanisms are at work. And in that talk, they lay out, or in that paper rather, they review 5 different mechanisms that they argue can promote cooperation in various settings. So the top 3 are the ones that are really relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll spend some time discussing each of those. Multi-level selection and kin selection are also mechanisms I can talk about Q&A if you're curious. But so direct reciprocity, pretty straightforward. I think most of us are familiar with it, at least in the colloquial sense. Repeated cooperation, or excuse me, repeated encounters, repeated interaction between folks promotes cooperation under what Axelrod famously called the shadow of the future. Right. So if I interact with Josh and I anticipate that I'm going to interact with Josh in the future, it's more likely that I'll behave cooperatively towards Josh, and I hope that he'll return that to me in the near future. The second mechanism is called structured populations. So agents interact with those near them, which enables clusters of conditional cooperators to sustain cooperation. So there's some types of structured populations that are relevant, including geographic structures and network structures. So geography can induce cooperation by effectively inducing direct reciprocity. So largely this comes out of like anthropological work where they're showing that people who are, say, in a village that's in a mountain valley, and so because of the topology of the environment, they're sort of forced to interact with other groups who are near them. And so that geographic, so that segregation effectively induces cooperation. Of course, more relevant to my work is how network structures can promote cooperation. And there, I'll say more about this as we go on, but basically the structure of the network, the topology that ensures individuals are connected means that they're going to interact repeatedly. So both of these are ways of inducing direct reciprocity. Being embedded in the network ensures that tie means that you're going to, can be interacting with those people repeatedly. Now, interestingly, there's a lot of work on how the topology of the network or the pattern of ties in networks affect cooperation. And there's kind of a nice little step-like pattern where they find that, let's say a well-mixed population, meaning just at random, we get very low rates of cooperation. But if you embed people in a random network, we get slightly higher rates of aggregate cooperation. From there, going from random, if we put people in a lattice type structure, we get even higher rates of cooperation. And then in terms of static networks, the topology that breeds the most kinds of cooperation is clustered networks. And there's been sufficient work on that we can say effectively conclusively that conditional cooperators who happen to be in particular clusters are structurally insulated from defectors. And so there can be like sections or pieces of the network where we have high rates of cooperation. A third mechanism that I'll be talking about today, at least these reputations can solve a theoretical problem, but reputations can induce cooperation in part because, like, if I'm interacting with Josh and there's an audience, I'm more likely to behave pro-socially towards Josh in the hopes that the other people who observe me behaving pro-socially will return that in the future. It's often called indirect reciprocity in the literature. And yeah, there's those other two mechanisms that we talk about in Q&A. So I'm going to be looking at the behavior of humans embedded in networks. So those two mechanisms are inherently kind of relevant to that problem, but the mechanism I'm going to use to solve the problem has to do with reputation. So that's why I'm going over these things. All right, so how is it that networks promote cooperation? So we've got two pictures here. This is a clustered network, and this is a network with a scale-free degree distribution. What that just means degree distribution is skewed. So few of the nodes have many of the ties, and most of the nodes have few of the ties. So in this network, the node size is proportional to degree or the number of ties. So you've got these hubs that have large numbers of ties and a bunch of nodes on the periphery that have few ties. So I kind of hinted at this when I was discussing the previous slide, but in these networks, they induce cooperation by conditional cooperators just winding up in the same clusters. So if just by chance you get a lot of conditional cooperators in the red cluster, they're structurally insulated because in those clusters, there's a high baseline probability they're connected to other people in that cluster. And so if there's a lot of conditional cooperators, we can see high rates of cooperation over here, but not necessarily in any of the other three colors. Although it's possible that you have conditional cooperators in multiple colors. Over here, we've got basically the evidence suggests that as people get added to networks, we have this property of preferential attachment. And so if there's any information about how cooperative the nodes are, people latch on to more cooperative people compared to less cooperative people. And that leads to the conditional cooperators winding up as the hubs in these networks. And then because they have so many ties, they can sustain some relations to defectors. But basically, there's work by Martin Nowak and colleagues showing that the number of ties affects rates of cooperation such that these hubs are just more likely to maintain their ability to cooperate because of they just have so many ties. So everything that I discussed here has to do with static network structures, meaning that networks that do not change, which pretty unrealistic, especially when you're talking about social relations, right? So if Josh defects against me, I just say, later, Josh, go find somebody else to talk to, right? That's a dynamic network. I can alter my ties. So we know there's good and lots of evidence suggesting that dynamic networks promote the evolution of cooperation. And this works through 3 mechanisms. I've only got 2 listed here, but there's ample evidence suggesting that cooperators will punish defectors by simply shedding their ties, meaning delete that relation and seek out somebody else with whom to interact. And then we also know that when reputation information is available, so that is, the extent to which Josh or I or any of you are cooperative, impacts the formation of new ties and networks. So defectors are avoided when seeking new ties. And then one other thing I should have up here is we know that defectors are also more likely to go extinct in dynamic networks. I'm using evolutionary terms, but in other terms, like defectors are more likely to be excluded from these networks. We showed in a 2018 paper, basically you start with cooperators and defectors well mixed throughout the network, and we could watch it change. I don't think we actually published this result, but it was interesting to watch as the experiments were going. You see the defectors kind of start out well mixed, and then the conditional cooperators form this core in the network, and the defectors get pushed to the periphery, and eventually they just disappear. They're dying off. They don't have any ties left, and so they just get booted out. So past work, largely experimental, assumes that people sort on pro-social reputations. So there's this, let's call it a paradigm for studying the evolution of cooperation with human subjects. And most of the time, they give the participants limited information because it's experimental settings, and that's just what you do in an experiment. But a lot of the research will give people this is how many times Josh has cooperated with his partners in the past, and this is how many times I've cooperated with my partners in the past. So the experimental paradigm gives people that information, but the real world findings suggest that people don't really sort on cooperativeness with their friends, for example. So a paper by my colleague Brent Simpson showed that there's effectively no evidence in uncontrolled observations or non-experimental settings that people are tied to people who have similar rates of cooperativeness. People are pretty bad at guessing how cooperative their friends are going to be, for example. So it's kind of an unrealistic assumption that people make that actually sort on cooperativeness in uncontrolled settings. So social identity theory from psychology provides reasons why individuals would select others with similar social identities, which we know happens. So it's something called homophily that you've probably heard of that exists in the social world. Basically, ties occur between people who share attributes at much higher rates than we would expect by chance. And so some of the reasons why this is relevant here in the context of cooperation, social identity theory says that basically you have higher baseline trust for people who you share attributes with. And so that increased trust means that, well, if I trust Josh, then that means I think Josh is going to cooperate with me. And so people, at least our opinion, people are using social identities as a heuristic, right? They're filtering their social world, trying to make sense of the social world through these heuristics. And so social differentiation is one of those heuristics. And so we think we can trust people who are similar to us, and we know that that trust in turn promotes cooperation. So if individual decisions in these networks show preference for in-group members, the aggregate result turns out to be the segregation of ties, even though we don't make any, we don't have necessarily reasons for this, aside from these heuristics or these cognitive biases that affect how they're operating in these environments. So further, if there's group level differences in rewards, which we know there are in the real world, these basic processes contribute to the cumulative advantage, effectively, where the resource differences grow over time because people are selecting on people like themselves due to social identity processes, and that results in larger between group inequalities. So I think of these emergent inequalities between folks as negative externalities of the dynamic networks of these processes. So here I'm going to summarize some past work where we demonstrated these negative externalities. So what we showed was how reputations for prosociality and basic social differentiation combine to shape the coevolution of structure and cooperation. What we were looking at here is if people are differentiated in social networks, there's just very basic predictions from social identity theory that if people have a slight preference for in-group members, we're going to see the emergence of segregation in those networks. And here I'm talking about segregation of network ties. I think Josh and I use segregation in slightly different senses. So we talked a bit about this. I don't want to mischaracterize your work, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you're looking at spatial segregation in terms of like geographic locations and how people are spending time in different locations. Here, what I'm talking about segregation of ties, or the inability of people to cross boundaries by way of social differentiation. So this earlier work, we used a relatively large web-based experiment. So for both the studies I'll talk about today, I used this software platform called Breadboard, which was developed at the Yale Network Center. And what it's a scalable software, meaning you can have participants, I think they say up to several thousand nodes. But basically what it does is it generates a network with some topology that you set, and then your participants become nodes in that network. And so who they can interact with is defined by some underlying network. They don't necessarily know the full topology of the network. They just are given what information we provide to them. But we can experimentally manipulate aspects of the network that they're embedded in. And then they play repeated economic games where their partners are defined by the network ties. So in this case, both the studies we'll look at, I was looking at prisoners dilemma games, which is the standard way of studying cooperation between humans. So here we had 650 participants from 2 universities. These were undergrad students who played iterated prisoners dilemma games on dynamic networks. And all of the key manipulation was just whether the university affiliation was salient. We don't actually say this in the paper, but the 2 universities were Ohio State University, you might imagine, and the University of South Carolina, which is where my collaborator works. I mention that because there's no rivalry between schools. Like I would imagine we would have gotten much stronger if that we use Michigan and Ohio State, for example. I think about football, but like the Ohio State students and USC students, there's nothing going on there. It's just a nominal distinction. And so key results, we did find that net of the reputation scores, so that is net of how cooperative people were. Participants cooperated with in-group members at higher rates, just based on university affiliation. We also found net of the reputation scores, participants were more likely to select in-group members when that information was available. So in some of the networks, the university affiliation was salient or known to each other, and that was just like the label on the participant screen would say like USC1 or OSU1. And that was the only way that the universities were made salient. And in those conditions, we found the emergence of segregation between the 2 groups, such that Ohio State students were more likely to be tied to Ohio State students, and USC students were more likely to be tied that way. So we found that segregation of relationships in these networks emerged in all conditions where any kind of social differentiation is known. And of course, this is low stakes social differentiation, just university affiliation. It doesn't really have much consequences. Or at least I don't think it does. So moving on, what we're talking, well, I should say, like that was largely, I think of it as a negative contribution, right? We showed the emergence of segregation and the emergence of between group inequality, but we didn't have any solutions for what was going on. We just kind of documented the inequality. So what I'm going to pivot towards talking about is how can we, let's say, fix that. I'm going to take an ideological stance and just say segregation is a bad thing. So how can we eliminate that? So we know that dynamic networks increase cooperation, but they also increase segregation and between group inequality. That's just some of my past work. So the question I'm trying to address now is, can we sustain high rates of cooperation while minimizing segregation between groups and potentially inequality between groups? So I know from social identity theory, I discussed a little bit earlier, that the within group cooperation is high because potentially there's higher baseline trust for in-group members, right? If you share demographic information with other people, the assumption, or at least the social identity theory suggests you trust those people. So I want to know, can we develop a reputation system that just explicitly conveys that information, as opposed to letting people use these cognitive biases that impact how they're making decisions in these settings. So there's a recent theory called unbounded indirect reciprocity theory. And that theory suggests that concerns for reputation are global, meaning if I'm going to cooperate with Josh, it doesn't, like the demographics of the observers do not matter to me. I just want to be perceived as being pro-social, regardless of whether the audience is in-group members or out-group members. So given that finding, we argue that distinguishing reputations, that is how the participants in studies or how individuals in general treat in-group members versus out-group members, by providing that information, we might be able to overcome that cognitive bias of trusting in-group members more. because people use that bias, that just, oh, I can trust somebody who's like me and I can't trust this person who isn't like me as much. In this setting of cooperativeness, we can just tell them how cooperative people are, so they don't have to use that heuristic, if that makes sense. At least that's what our logic is. So we think that the reputation concern can mitigate some of the observed effects of identity and cooperation and segregation that we found. So specifically, shared identity can serve as a heuristic. At least that's what social identity theory suggests, and what we found that results in the emergence of segregation. But in this study, we asked if we just provided people with in-group and out-group reputations, could we undermine the need for those heuristics of relying on people who are supposedly more trustworthy because they're in-group members. So given that kind of logic, we've got some basic hypotheses for this new study. So we want to replicate the 2020 paper. So basically the salient social identity should increase in-group cooperation due to basic social identity processes relating to trust. So that has to do with cooperation in terms of network dynamics. There's also preferential attachment for people like themselves. So that's the second hypothesis. Social identity will promote preferential attachment to in-group members. And then eventually that should result in, after people, through time, as these sort of subtle biases have a chance to aggregate in the network, that should give rise to segregation in networks. So this is just replicating what we've already done, but now we want to try to intervene to stop that process from happening. So we're going to implement a reputation system in the network that parses or separates out how the participants treat in-group members and out-group members, or how people in general treat in-group members and out-group members. So given that, we would argue that the salient social identity should be unrelated to cooperativeness, because people are no longer selecting partners based on trust, or at least biases associated with trust, but instead are selecting partners that truly know their reputations. So that should decrease the preferential attachment for in-group members, because you don't need to use that bias anymore, you have the information. So that should result in networks that are not segregated at the end. And my title already teased what I found, but I'll go through my results anyway. It's not moving. Okay, there we go. So this is another experiment that we ran on the breadboard system. Said a little bit about that before. In this study, it was a little bit bigger. We used a little over 1,000 participants. Some of my prior work, we used to use Amazon Mechanical Turk for this. Actually, breadboard was set up to be linked explicitly with Amazon Mechanical Turk. But so it's one of these crowdsourcing websites. Assume some familiarity with it. The recent methods literature suggests that Turk is not the best crowdsourcing platform. There's a lot of bots. There's a lot of people who have like multiple accounts. And so there's reason to question data quality to some extent. I mean, there are checks that you can be put in place, but here we're dealing with large scale of data. And so we didn't want to have to go through all those checks. So we just paid a little bit more for better data. So we used Prolific to crowdsource. So we got all these participants were adults living in the United States, despite the fact that Prolific's based in the UK. There's a sufficient sample of US participants for us to use. So those 1,000 participants were distributed across 40 different networks. And the breadboard app went for 18 rounds. So they played 18 rounds of iterated economic games with prisoners' loans with their partners. So this graph up at the top right is the a histogram of network size. So what we would do, just in terms of like administering these large scale experiments, we typically admit like 45 to 50 participants into a waiting room where they would read instructions about our study. And then we would quiz them to see if they understood the instructions, and people who didn't pass the quiz just got kicked out. And then when we went to start the session, we had it set to be 20 was the minimum. So if we had fewer than 20 people who passed the quiz, we didn't run the session. If we had more than 28 participants, we just randomly kicked people out to get down to 28. So the box is kind of over, but the largest one is 28. And then we had a few cases of 20. So that was just each of the cases had 20 to 28 participants. So given that, they literally just made decisions whether to cooperate or defect with each of their partners, prisoner's dilemma style. It wasn't just binary. In this case, we used a more, it's not continuous, it's ordinal from 0, which is complete defection, and they could give 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 points. And the points that were given were doubled, which is how they derive value from the interactions. And so we had the 40 networks and 4 experimental conditions. So we have 10 networks per condition. So I'll say more about the manipulation on the next slide. And the network updates or the dynamic part occurred every 4 rounds, meaning that they would, they had the initial network topography and that defined with whom they could interact. And then they'd interact with those people for 4 rounds. And then it would switch and say, okay, now do you want to delete any of your partners? And they could say yes or no, and then pick who they want to delete. And then if they deleted somebody, they'd take them to a different screen that showed them everybody else who was available, right? So if there was 28 people in the network, and they had 3 ties, then they could delete one, and then they would be showing the other 24 people and say, okay, who do you want to connect with? And then we vary the information that they had about the other people in the study. So this is the only manipulation in this particular study. Was just the reputation regime, I guess we can call it, that we implemented at the network level. So in the control condition, the reputations were just based on how cooperative the participants were. Just a single reputation score that showed the percent of their cooperativeness up to that point in the study. Complete information, right? Which is kind of unrealistic, but this is what folks do, and this is the paradigm that's kind of evolved here. And there was no other distinguishing information. All the nodes were the same color, for example. Then we had 3 different ways where we tinkered with the reputations. So we had undifferentiated, parochial, and intra-group reputations. So undifferentiated, politics were salient. So in this study, we asked participants at the very beginning, there was a pre-study questionnaire, and we asked them to identify liberal conservative. Although it's not a perfect mapping with Republicans and Democrats, we used that information to sort them into Republicans and Democrats. That was the social differentiation here. So it's different than it was in the first study where we were using university affiliation, but this is, let's just say, a more useful example of segregation. So politics were salient. So Democrats were coded blue, Republicans were coded red, and reputations were based on total given capacity. So the reputation information didn't change, but we also implemented social differentiation. So they got 1 score, again, just how cooperative they were historically at that point in the study, but then the nodes were also color-coded according to politics. Parochial reputations, this manipulation was basically based on some prior research showing that people are more likely to know the reputations of in-group members, like due to homophily, gossip flows through channels that they're similar to, on demographic information. So politics were salient, but reputations were based just on treatment of in-group members. So they had 1 score, but this one wasn't a global score for how they treat everyone. This was just how they treat in-group members. And then the most theoretically relevant condition, the inter-group condition, where each person had 2 reputations, how they treat in-group members, how they treat out-group members. So if it's a Republican, this is how the Republican is treating Republicans, how they're treating them. Or in-group means how they treat the Republicans, out-group means how they treat Democrats. So we parse that information. So hopefully there's some synergy, or you can see the lineup between the social identity theory and what's going on in this prediction, right? So social identity theory suggests that people are more likely to trust in-group members, and that's sort of a cognitive bias that affects their cooperation rates and who they're pairing with. And so the thinking here is if we just explicitly give them information so they don't have to assume who's trustworthy, we can actually see it, that should reduce those social differentiation effects. Okay, so a little bit more about the methods and what we did. So this is some screenshots from the breadboard app, just so you can see what it looks like. So this was at the beginning of the study. So here we've got a Republican participant with 2 Republican partners and 2 Democrat partners. At the beginning of the study, everyone was given 1,000 monetary units that's converted to cash at the end of the study. So they were actually like incentivized for their behavior in the study. So this is what the prisoner's dilemma setup looks like. So in this case, they're asking how do they want to behave towards node E here, who's a Democrat. And so they could defect by giving none, or they could cooperate by giving certain amounts, and then it tells them what happens. Like if you give them 50, you lose 50 points, they gain 100. What's this, the results screen? Yeah, so this is the results screen, which just summarizes what happens. It tells them what their behavior was and what the partner's behavior was and what the end result is in terms of how many points they get. Sorry, it's kind of grainy to see on this, but that's just the results that they get back. And this is the network dynamics. So this is where you may choose to cut your ties with one of your neighbors. And so they just list them out here. And so the participant could drop any one of their alters or say no change to their network, like they're satisfied with what has happened. And so there's no need to delete anybody. And then it reminds them what these people did to them recently, in case they have a hard time keeping that straight. So It's like neighbor E gave you 20 this round and you received 40. So they can just see what happened. And this is to make a new neighbor screen. So this would be after they've deleted somebody, then this is what the information is given. And so this is everybody else in the study to whom they're not presently tied. And then there's information here about their current endowment, how much they gave their partners on average on the last round. And that's the information that they get when they're selecting new partners. Any questions or comments before we interrupt?
I just have a quick question, and maybe you'll get to this. Do they know how many rounds they're playing? Like, do they know when they're near the end?
Really good question. So economists are concerned about end game effects. And what the economists typically do is give some probability that the game ends so that it's uncertain. We just don't tell them how many rounds there's going to be. So no, they don't know. We should kind of ask, like, at what point did you get squirrely in the study? But the whole thing typically took less than 45 minutes. So in terms of like, how do we model this data? So we've got over 1,000 participants embedded in networks, and it's longitudinal because they're doing this iteratively. So the scale of data is kind of large, and there's lots of dependence in the data. So for example, just the cooperation decisions, we've got decisions per alter. So they're typically making multiple individual decisions for each of their connections. And we've got that level of nesting. And then we've got that through time, right? Those are nested in rounds, and rounds are nested in participants. And then those participants are nested in networks. So I think of this as 4-level data. But one of those levels is a network, which is not something that you can just include in a multi-level model in a straightforward fashion. And so that's just one of the outcomes. It turns out that all of the things that we model have a similar dependent structure that's a pain to deal with analytically. So given this data structure, we can address some of it through like just standard multi-level models. Parametric models can address nesting due to time and multiple decisions per round, but not the network dependencies. So we know that network dependence induces anti-conservative variance estimation. So there's this really great paper that came out just a couple of years ago by Eugen Lee and Elizabeth Ogburn titled "Network Dependence Can Lead to Spurious Associations and Invalid Inference." So this was the first time, to my knowledge, that they showed that network dependence can affect your regression coefficients. For years and years, we used to think that network structures would make regression coefficients. So I'm just trying to get the term right. Unbiased but inefficient is the term that's often used in the stats literature. So unbiased means we get the regression coefficients right, but inefficient means we get the standard errors wrong. Well, it turns out that we're also getting the regression coefficients wrong, and that's what they showed in this paper. But not only did they show that we were getting the regression, they also provided a solution, which is why I really like that paper. So they pulled in some stuff from geography on Moran's eye as a measure of spatial association. They just implemented that in the network context, so you can see if you've got high levels of network dependence in your network data. So I have more to say about that when we get into the results, but given this problem of network dependence and not being able to use parametric inference, we instead use non-parametric inference. We use permutation tests, meaning that we just permute the outcome, calculate the regression coefficient, save that, and run it 999 more times so that we get a sampling distribution on the regression coefficients. So basically all the results are based on non-parametric results, with the sole exception of when I'm looking at the network as the unit of analysis, because I only have 40 data points then, but each data point is the result from a whole network. And so those networks are independent from one another. So the significance tests in the regression models came from permutation tests, and then I use marginal means to illustrate interactions. And so in that context, I can't use the popular delta method that folks typically use with margins on their models. So here I just use the bootstrap of 90% of my data with replacement of it to draw those the error around margins, model margins. So this is just some descriptive. Well, this is descriptive. Boy, that color sucks. Sorry. So there's some of it is me, some of it is that the projecting is a little off, but hopefully you can see the distinguishing factors. This is the descriptive statistics for cooperation through time. So one thing I'll point out is it has this sort of weird step pattern, and that has to do with when the network dynamics occur. So if you call network dynamics occur every 4 rounds. And so we start to see largely like cooperation starts to fall off, and then all of a sudden they remember, oh, I can be punished for my behavior. And then you see these jumps in cooperation, punished meaning like people can delete their ties. And so that's basically what happens is you fall into a pattern and then there's this opportunity where the network changes, and that's when you get feedback on your behavior. And so if people are deleting ties, we see increases in cooperation. So in dynamic networks, we do see high rates of cooperation in general, and that's what we reproduce towards the end of our study. But before we get to the end of the study, there's some interesting dynamics occurring in how we get to those high rates of cooperation. So in this condition where we separate the reputations by in-group and out-group members, you see the highest rates of cooperation at baseline and just on average. And then the lowest, this is like just the pattern we find in these data repeatedly, when they just have the in-group reputation is where we find the lowest rates of cooperation on average. That's just descriptively, this is a model of cooperation for rounds 1 through 8. So we basically said we want to know what happens before equilibrium, before everyone is cooperating at high rates. So we just modeled basically this part of the data to look for differences in cooperation patterns statistically. And so in the, this is by, I want to use the word homophily, but on the graph it says same politics alter, meaning interacting with people who share similar politics. The orange dots are not same politics alter or heterophilous ties. So in the control condition where they don't know this information, of course, there's no difference between those two groups. But then we get sort of the emergence of difference with the different reputation regimes. So the one that we thought might impact cooperation most was the inter-group where they have two reputations. And here there is a slight significant difference, but it's the smallest gap of the experimental condition. So you'll notice that the gap kind of grows. This is the standard just showing red and blue nodes, and here we get a stronger effect, and then here's the parochial reputation. Another thing I'll point out about this is that just on average, the means get smaller, right? So there's just less cooperation here. It's like, if you average those 2 points, it's like right here. So you can see that's less than there. So there's less cooperation in general, depending on the type of reputation. And then this is in terms of network dynamics, so in terms of tie changes. So this is descriptive statistics. The y-axis is just the proportion who dropped an alter at each of the opportunities to do so. So after round 4, what proportion of nodes in each condition dropped an alter? And so we find a similar pattern that we did on the previous slide, where the folks who are in the reputation condition where they, it's parsed by in-group, out-group, that we see the least amount of network turnover in that condition, right? The fewest people wanting to even change or alter their network. And the parochial reputation condition where they just reputation in-groups, that's where we see the most network turnover there. This is descriptive, this is inferential. So this is the probability of dropping an existing alter after controlling for timing and number of partners. And I don't remember all the covariates, but basically anything I could think of to throw in there. And what we find is these 3 conditions have a roughly an equal probability of dropping a tie, but those who, when reputations are parsed, there's just less network turnover than there is in the other conditions. So that in terms of dynamics, previously it was just showing like dropping ties. Now this is the actual behaviors associated with who they're dropping and who they're selecting. So this is a graph of who they choose to drop, and this is a graph of who they choose to select. And this is the marginal effect of the same party on dropping others. So that means like being in the same party, are you going to drop somebody who's in the same party? So the only one that's significant is the just in-group reputation. And what we find is that people in that condition were less likely to drop in-group members than to drop out group members, whereas group membership doesn't affect who they're dropping over here. Then once they pick somebody to delete, they then make a decision on who to select. And so this is the effect of in-group members on who they're picking. So in the control condition where they don't have that information, of course, it doesn't have an effect. But then we find a very similar pattern where when the reputations are parsed, people are more likely to pick an in-group member, but that effect is not as strong as it is when the reputations are undifferentiated or when you just get the in-group reputations. So we've got, it's subtle differences in cooperation patterns. We've got differences in who's altering their networks. And then when they do decide to alter the networks, it's affecting who they're dropping and who they're adding in the networks. So given those various behaviors, that results in this emergence of various properties, like what do we see emerging in the networks towards the end? So this is At the end of the network, at the end of the study, at the end of round 18, we just calculated how much clustering there was in the network using Duncan class measure. It's just the probability that two of your partners are tied to each other. It's clustering coefficient. And then the network segregation of ties. So between group segregation of ties, the two measures that were shown here. So we find that clustering increases in these networks, which is a result we've kind of known for years. Conditional cooperators wind up connecting with each other, and that results in increased clustering. Over here is the results for segregation. And this is the undifferentiated and the procreal reputation condition. Segregation emerges there, and it's relatively higher rates. We've got the control condition is this light gray line, and then this is where we parse the reputations. So we do see a slight increase in segregation where the reputations are parsed, but then it kind of evens out and maybe even decreases a little bit. So this is my favorite part of the analysis because it's so simple. I've got 40 continuous measures for each network. So it's just so simple. So simple. It's so great. This is an OLS regression. Sorry, like I had to do 4-level models that have permutation tests for the other results. This is OLS. It's great. So this is literally just it's modeling the clustering in the network and the segregation in the network at the end of the study. And what we find is the constant is the control group, the reference category is the control group. So for segregation, we find that when it's just in-group reputations, there's significantly more segregation. When it's undifferentiated reputations, there's also significantly more segregation. But the intergroup condition where we parse that information, we don't find significant differences in segregation. So this condition where we've made the reputation scores parsed so that people know explicitly how their partners behave towards in-group members and out-group members, we get the same rates of segregation as we do, and they don't even know political affiliation of their partners. Yeah, this just shows that all of these increase in clustering over time, which is what the graph showed on the previous slide. So I think that's my key result. I want to show you kind of what that looks like. Right here. So this is a plot of the top is the margins. The marginal means are the predicted segregation in the networks by condition. So this is the predicted segregation control condition, which is the margin at round 18. And there's the margin for the intergroup condition right there. So it also overlaps with 0. And here we see higher rates of segregation in the other two conditions. So I went through and looked at all of the data of each of the 40 networks and pulled out one from each of the conditions that reflected the amount of segregation that's depicted just on average. So in the control condition, the segregation is minus 0.06, like that's what it is for all of the data. So this is one of the networks that has the same amount of segregation. So you can see just on the ground what it looks like. So here's 0.09 is the measure of segregation. I think it's the same as the margin. I feel like I was lucky. I only had 10 cases, but I was able to find one that had exactly the same amount of segregation. So here's 0.34 in the undifferentiated reputation condition. And then here in the parochial reputation, you've got the highest segregation. And you can see here, you've got like the conservative nodes are off on the periphery, only tied to effectively each other right here. I will mention, just to preempt a question in the Q&A, there was slightly more Democrats in these data. It was like a 60-40 split. We tried to oversample on Republicans, but we didn't oversample enough. But Republicans were less cooperative on average. And so they were more likely to be excluded as a result of that. But you can just see they're far more integrated in control in that intergroup condition than they are in the other two. Oh yeah, so for robustness, I just realized I'm trying to learn over time. So we did tests for network dependence. So for I had 40 networks and there were 18 rounds. So what I did was just estimated the extent of network dependence between cooperation and network ties in each network round for each network. Just did it once and then put it on the loop to calculate how much dependence there was in every network. So what we did there was we flagged network rounds where there was significant network dependence, and then we pulled them out of the data and reran the models, and everything has been robust to network dependence. And then we also tested for moderation by gender, by whether the participants are Republican or Democrat, and then by whether the participant was politically extreme. One of the reviewers wanted to know, like, could these results just be driven by extremists that really don't like out-group members? So that means like very Democratic or very conservative participants. So we just calculated that and we treated it as a dummy variable and tested So there is some differences in the averages, but the same, the pattern of results holds by all three of those factors. I'm going to skip this just through time in the interest of time. So these participants were clearly after money, like they get paid based on their behavior. And so given that, let's say problem, it's unclear how this would translate into real world interactions where interactions are not zero sum like they are in a prisoner's dilemma. So we know many political outcomes are not zero sum. You just want the opponent to lose, right? It's not the same as you want to increase your or maximize your utility. So that's one thing that is certainly relevant, something we're thinking about. And then another thing is the reputation system in this network was objective. And we know that's not the case. So there's empirical evidence that we have more information about more centrally located actors and networks. And we also know that the information you have about more centrally located actors is more accurate than what we have about peripheral networks or peripheral nodes. And so one of the things I'd like to study next is the coevolution of the reputation alongside the cooperative behavior. Which is the next step. Yeah, so I'm gonna skip it. I could just mention this. The next thing, the study here is the translational impact of this work. Basically, can we implement a system? I'm thinking like something like a Twitter setup where you parse the reputations, see if that impacts the evolution of political segregation, online interactions, for example. I'm happy to take questions. No comments, no comments. Okay, yeah, Tim.
Yeah, well, thanks much for the really insightful presentation. Two questions. One is clarification, the other is a real test. Okay. So the first simple question is, if you go back to your OLS regression results, so you may have defined this, but I don't remember. So for me, it's a surprise for me to see this. Okay, for me, as long as some segregation, there will be clustering related. Okay, maybe definitionally they are totally different in your case. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, sure. So let me back up further. So this is a network that has clustering and segregation.
Yeah.
Right. So they don't have to necessarily go hand in hand. So like you've got high clustering here, but they're not with each other. So you can imagine where, let's just say like the red nodes were the cooperators and these were the defectors, right? You can see how it can result in a broader topology that includes both. I don't know if that clarifies.
Yeah, well, to a degree, yes.
Okay.
Because still, if you combine those two, they're still somewhat correlated, right? Because as long as you have one type, which is like that, okay,
Yeah.
then you could also have a differentiation of the two. Yeah,
Sure.
both cases can be true, right?
Yeah, that's true. Both can be true. Yeah. You know, that's the nice thing about networks as complex systems. With just 20 nodes, there's all kinds of ways that ties could be arranged.
So your results, they are not.
Yeah, no, clustering and segregation emerge independently.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
two of my conditions. Yeah.
Fair enough. The real question is about thinking as a social demographer. In our literature, we often study assorted mating. For me, assorted mating is sort of like, dynamic network over time. And so there's been a huge debate about whether assorted mating would increase economic inequality versus not. Okay, so it's not unsettled yet. Okay, so I'm beginning to think about this implication for the real research in the real world. Seems to me, in this case, segregation is increased by this kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So that, which also means
Inequality too. We're
yeah,
not sure that.
inequality too,
Yeah.
whether or not you have real results to buttress that. So in the real world, economic can be increased, like because of the dynamics. Yeah. And that's one part. The other part is would you also consider sort of making sort of like a dynamic network?
Yeah, I absolutely would. And there's more recently, like just in the last 5 or 10 years, there's work on the coevolution of various networks. Something that the dynamic network folks are working on. And so one of the first questions that I hope gets addressed is how like friendship networks shape dating networks and those kinds of networks, because we are embedded in multiple networks at any given time. And what you're talking about is one network. There's all kinds of networks depending on what kind of relations you're interested in. And they have various effects on each other. So here we're just generically talking about connections. It's not a type of relation. in particular. But if I were to translate this into the real world, you'd have to talk, give people a concrete location to measure to get a sense of what the network topology looks like. I feel like I'm missing part of your question now.
The first part is in the real world, the implication of the research that the economic inequality will be increased because of segregation.
That's a good question. So where we've thought about this is largely in terms of translation, we've thought about just implementing it in online spaces. We've not thought about how to implement this face to face.
I think it's possible. I don't know.
Yeah.
If you apply this concept to like, professional networks, occupational networks, so on and so forth, then you're gonna increase that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we show experimentally is if there's between group inequality at the start.
Yeah.
That just grows with time due to these processes. You've got people, they select ties within each other and then the cooperation can. But it's a slow trajectory because of the way it's set up, but basically the between group differences just grow linearly with time as the interactions proceed. I don't know who was first. Andy, I know your name. I'm gonna call it.
I had a question about the evolutionary premise for the research, which I found interesting at the beginning, you mentioned a number of different conditions that a study that you mentioned said were the exceptions to the rule that cooperation is not incentivized in evolution. And I'm wondering what the basis is for that study for saying that overall, from an evolutionary perspective, that cooperation is disincentivized. Is it just a truism based on common understandings of Darwinian natural selection, or is it based on a particular analysis?
Yeah, I mean, it's not based on a mathematical model. It's just based on Darwinian evolutionary mechanics. Given the definition of cooperation, where I decrease my fitness to benefit you, that applies in the face of natural selection. As a concept, it's just not something I should do. So we have to figure out why it is. I would be willing to do that. So one of the first mechanisms that was explained having to do with that was kin selection, which I didn't talk about at all. But if we're related, why would I take a bullet for my son? For example, that doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective unless you think about kin selection. I want to keep my genes alive, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's largely coming out of evolutionary biology. And then, it started there, and then there was some collaboration between Martin Rand and Nowak is two authors I cite here. David Rand is a computational biologist who's now doing social science full time, and Nowak is an evolutionary biologist. And the reason I mention that is their collaborations it puts papers in interdisciplinary science journals that introduce the paradigm that I'm using effectively, and basically made this problem salient to more social. It's not just evolutionary biologists or anthropologists who are studying this process. Now we've got physicists and the whole interdisciplinary community working on these kinds of problems.
Do you think there's room for an interpretation, or especially based on the work that you've done on these experiments, that cooperation might not be as unnatural as we typically think it is? Or I'm just thinking of I know that it's the way that you described it in terms of decreasing your own chances to benefit another. Maybe for your own survival, that might be obviously antithetical, but for in the aggregate, from a collectivist standpoint, that isn't typically how we view things from a Darwinian perspective, but maybe there's a different way to think about cooperation in less individualistic terms. I'm curious what you think about that.
I have a sense, or what I think. This is in no way definitive, but my sense is, if you could put a person in a vacuum, they would behave selfishly. But we're not. From birth, we're embedded in social networks. We're embedded in these various mechanisms are all playing out throughout our entire life course. So there's no way to know what it's independent of those processes, because we're all social beings. We're all embedded in networks. We all have kin. These various, and multi-level selection is another one to talk about, but competition between groups is natural processes. And so I do think we do observe high rates of cooperation all over the place, not just amongst humans, but in various places in nature, there's cooperation. But I think it has to do with the fact that these structures are in place.
Yeah.
They're in place, right? So as you're being socialized, the whole life force is embedded in these processes. So we do see high rates of cooperation all over the place, but I do think it has to do with these mechanisms, just being in place, and giving rise to why it's observed so often. It's my sense. Yeah, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
I had like a clarification question and also like a further implication question. So I was really surprised by the fact that your group of like the infra and the intergroup that they both see like how much the other members are cooperative with them or like the other people is not that effective in like creating segregation. So I was wondering how much those values are actually different. Like, have you looked at the statistics of the difference between how much people are actually helping the people in their group versus the people outside of their group? I think I lost that somewhere.
Yeah, so the only thing I can point to for that, I mean, this is a graph I showed, but I didn't really make this point. So there, like, here's the differences on average, but this is also just the first half of the data. So there were some slight differences in cooperation when reputations were parsed. If I told participants how they treat their active members, we do have a slight, but here we have stronger differences in cooperation.
Yeah, I know that, like, but if I understand the case correctly, the experiment correctly, these people are seeing how much the other member is treating Democrats and how much they are also treating Republicans, right?
Yeah.
They have like a reputation score.
Yeah, so the replication score is their cooperativeness.
Yes.
So that's what I'm saying is like, this difference in cooperation shows up in the network dynamic phase. Is like, this is how they treat their Republican partners, and how they treat their conservative partners.
Yes.
So there would have been these kinds of differences showing up on the screens of participants, at least on average.
Okay. Also, like a further implication question. So in your setup, you kind of almost have this ideal setup that there is no bounds formed between member before, and they like kind of through iterations they make these bounds. But in the real life setup, that is a little bit unrealistic because you already, for example, in like a inequality standpoint of like a economic equality standpoint, there are already many segregation built into the society.
Sure.
So I was wondering how this interventions will change the existing segregations and how much this will help to change the existing segregations. Like, would be interesting to maybe like run this analysis to certain stage and then do some intervention, and after that like the bonds are formed and everything, do some interventions and then see how that will change the existing structures.
Yeah. So there's so many contextual things that I think would matter there. So one of the things that I know for just based on my own research is like the topology of the underlying network. So these networks started off as random, but if they started off as clustered, then you get people that sort of more insulated from the bat, which is kind of one of the points you're making. But that's just like by us varying the topology, right? In the uncontrolled environments, there's high levels of clustering, but it varies across so many different dimensions. Here, they only have a single dimension to sort on. Well, cooperativeness, sort of, but that's kind of not really how it works in the real world. But they also had politics. But in uncontrolled observations, you've got race, gender, religion. I mean, there's so many dimensions that were sorted on in uncontrolled observations. So with that aspect, what were some of the other? There's just so many other. I'm thinking about translating the way you were mentioning. There's so many contextual factors. We're almost out of time. Is it okay if I pivot? Sure. It's a good question, but.
So I'm just kind of curious, it would seem here that cooperation should be much more common than it appears to be. And I wonder if one mechanism is like right here, every game involved the same amount of money as I understand it, but the people that defect a lot early will accumulate more wealth. And it could be that if they're playing with their own money in a sense, it would be better to be playing with someone who's rich but not trustworthy, because even if you only win a fraction of those games, you're making out ahead. It's kind of like the why does anyone do business with Donald Trump question, because it's like if the pot is big enough, it doesn't matter that it's fair. So I just wonder like whether you've replayed these games where people are playing with their accumulated wealth and there might be some benefit to cooperating with someone who's not cooperative.
So I think of that in terms of social capital. And we did a paper on that, but basically, cooperation, everybody's driving the same benefits from interaction. But in the uncontrolled observations, we know that's not the case. Like you might benefit from, I don't want to use Donald Trump as an example. I'm going to use Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Right. If I could do something with Barack Obama, I'm going to tell everyone about it. Because I would derive so much value from that interaction. And that's maybe let's change, like, let's think about co-authoring, right? Writing a paper together you have to collaborate, each person has to cooperate. But you're better off having a full professor than a graduate student as a partner, because the value that they contribute is higher. This is, I don't know if I'm getting at this issue.
It might be possible that it's actually to your advantage to choose to link yourself to someone who's not trustworthy if the pot is bigger. Because you don't have to win as many of those games. And that might make it possible for low cooperation individuals to not get kind of thrown out of the network, but in fact, they could remain central because, you know what I mean? Because actually that was the rational thing for their partners to do, which is to stay.
I mean, so in this setting, the defectors, they do fare well until they get kicked out. So in the long run, they don't, right? If they would be more cooperative and hang around for another 12 rounds, the end utility is higher than defecting against people, making twice as much for 4 rounds and then getting the boot, which is basically what happens. So we would have to alter the incentive structure. And I'm not sure if that would be altering so much so that it would be a different type of game than a PD game, for example, right? If that would still be studying cooperation, I'm not even sure. I'd have to like do the math to figure out what the incentive structure would be at that point. Yeah, good question, but it's not something I thought in detail.
If we have time.
Yeah, when I was doing.
Very quickly, it's not gender. So I'm curious to what extent, if any, you think this would scale up? And I know you can't run an experiment of this time on like an organization as a player or a country, but just conceptually, do you think the same kind of, I don't know, the same process could go on at, you know, when you scale up from the individual level of analysis?
Yeah, so I'm really trying to pull that off, honestly.
Yeah?
And then like the early 2010s, there was a paper in PNAS where they did one single study, and it was like 1,000 people in a network that ran synchronously. And what they did, it was like one of the first instances of mass collaboration, right? They got different labs from all over the place to get participants, and they crowdsourced. They like everyone they could get to bring into their study they did. So it would be great to have a single case where you could get folks to participate synchronously, because the software scales. Like I said at the beginning, right, it would go to several thousand nodes. I'm not sure we could get like tens of thousands. There'd be server issues. Amazon charges a fortune, but yeah, I think it's possible, and I would love to pull it off.
But
sometime
like
soon.
the scale up in terms of unit of analysis, do I mean, like.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Organizations behave, I mean, I guess it has to be
It's different unit
ultimately
analysis.
decision makers within an organization, but do organizations kind of view themselves in each other in these same kind of ways? And I was like, I don't know, that must be UCI net, right? I used to use that for like rule systems analysis, and that's kind of what I see, your very first one with the.
Oh, these, sorry. It's probably not worth the time, this kind of thing.
Yeah, that
Those
would
are
be.
from R, those are from,
Oh, they're from R, okay.
sorry, I'm a big.
But it, like. I don't know, the way that I've used those kind of graphs is with nation states as the nodes, and then you can have various things being the ties, and then just made me wonder if you think like the same kind of theoretical concepts can apply to larger units than just
Yeah.
people.
No, that's a great point. So I used to do like small lab-based studies with human subjects where it'd be like networks of 4 people. But my advisor, Linda Momo, would say the actor is defined in an abstract sense. It could be nation states, it could be organizational representatives. So it would be really fascinating to get like, you know, as a cover story, like you're a representative of an organization, you know, and then let this play out. So you're thinking of it in terms of an organizational actor. So it would represent organizations as the unit of analysis, particularly if you can get people who have vested interest in the organization. I think, you know, the literature and like the experimental design folks would say, yeah, there's no reason not to have it generalized. I would want to see results to see if it does, but I think it could be applied, yeah.
You think you could actually do that kind of experiment?
Yeah. I mean, if I could get the participants to agree, I think this would be harder than doing it with like 2,000 people, frankly. Get 2,000 people, just collaborate with a few labs, bring in a crowdsource, you can knock that out. And then you'd look at variation within the network.
Very cool.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the questions and for coming. Appreciate it.